Left me for dead, actually. I woke up in a body bag, and I'm laying on the ground with this body bag, and I'm going, what in the hell am I doing?
You are surrounded by fear, unknown, darkness, and there are people out there who desperately want to kill you.
January 30th, 1968. South Vietnam erupts. Cities once thought secure are suddenly battlegrounds. For the United States, a war they believed they were winning has transformed instantly into something unrecognizable. Vietnam reaches a breaking point. Beneath the surface of the war, a revolution is building, one that would shake the confidence of the United States and shift the direction of the entire conflict. This series of battles, known as the Tet Offensive, would become one of the most revolutionary turning points of the Vietnam War. But to understand why Tet shook the world, we have to return to where the conflict began. Long before Tet, Vietnam was already a nation divided politically, geographically, and philosophically. After the end of French colonial rule in 1954, Vietnam split into two, a communist North under Ho Chi Minh and a US-backed South. What would come was not just a war. It was a bloody revolution driven by ideals, nationalism, and patience. Ho Chi Minh's government framed the war against the South as a movement for the people. To them, the United States was just another France, a foreign power standing in the way of national liberation. Inside the South, a storm was brewing. Communist fighters in the South that fought for the North became the revolutionary force within South Vietnam itself. They called themselves the Viet Cong, recruiting farmers, students, and civilians to subvert the government from within. Instead of relying on size or weapons, they relied on surprise, endurance, and intelligence. In 1961, the United States, under President Kennedy, entered Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, in fear that if South Vietnam fell, then the rest of Southeast Asia would quickly follow under a communist rule. By 1965, President Johnson committed full military forces. General William Westmoreland took command of American troops, expanding a new strategy of search and destroy missions meant to put down revolutionary fighters. What began as advisors under President Kennedy grew into a full-scale military presence under Lyndon B. Johnson. By 1967, more than 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. By late 1967, victory was near, according to U.S. officials believing the Viet Cong were worn out and incapable of launching large attacks. The revolutionaries, on the other hand, had different plans. Following stalemates and heavy losses in the battlefield, North Vietnam had a plan involving a cunning attempt that would either make or break their entire army. This plan revolved around a national holiday, Tet. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important festival in Vietnam. During this holiday, the 7-day Tet truce was announced by North Vietnam, allowing soldiers from both sides to return home. Little did anybody know, this would lead to a devastating event, securing the outcome of the war. On January 30th, 1968, during Tet, the North Vietnamese forces launched one of the largest surprise attacks in modern history. A strike force of over 80,000 fighters attacked more than 100 cities and bases across South Vietnam. Major areas like Hue, Da Nang, and even the U.S. Embassy in the South's capital, Saigon, were all under attack. While this seems like a crucial military gain, this wasn't the case. In fact, the North suffered heavy losses, killing 3,000 to 15,000 in the South, which paled in comparison to the 40 to 60,000 Northern casualties. The Northern Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong failed to hold any captured territory and did not spark the uprising in South Vietnam. The aim of the Tet Offensive was to destroy the enemy's morale, and it did not do that, at least not in the way everyone was thinking. In a military sense, the communists suffered a heavy loss, but in a psychological sense, Tet was a revolutionary masterpiece. Any illusions of a swift victory vanished. The U.S. now faced the sobering reality of a long, bloody road ahead.
During the Democratic National Convention, you would have noticed a growing debate about whether the United States should continue fighting. On March 31st, 1968, President Johnson publicly announced that he would halt bombing and would not be running for president again. This temporarily led to de-escalation in relation to the war, but didn't fully solve this issue. North Vietnam took advantage of this halt of assault and rushed troops and resources to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This gave North Vietnam a sufficient amount of offensive material to launch attacks against South Vietnam. With the offense weakening Southern Vietnamese and North American forces, President Johnson decided to halt bombing north of the 20th parallel on the map, which avoided significant territory such as Hanoi and Haiphong. Apart from this, he also decided to limit soldiers being deployed in North Vietnam to avoid more casualties, with the amount of American soldier deaths within the war itself being 58,220, and in the Tet Offensive alone, 4,000 soldiers dead and 13,000 injured. This not only demoralized the American army, but decreased military power, losing 17,000 soldiers to fight on the side of South Vietnam. With the government's narrative stating that the war was nearly won to the public, the Pentagon Papers confirmed otherwise. Because of this, support for the war plummeted as the citizens began to question the war's viability.
Richard Nixon entered office promising peace with honor, yet the revolutionary movement continued gaining strength as U.S. forces slowly withdrew. It was only a matter of time before the revolution succeeded. While in office, Nixon introduced Vietnamization, a plan to reduce American troop levels while transferring responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. The Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973, formally ended direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. By 1975, U.S. combat troops were gone. South Vietnam stood alone against the revolutionary North. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, marking the end of the war. Operation Frequent Wind marked the final American evacuation from Vietnam, airlifting U.S. personnel and South Vietnamese civilians from the city and symbolizing the definitive end of American involvement. For the North, this was a final victory of a decades-long struggle. Vietnam was governed under communist control and Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City. A revolution that began as a resistance against colonial rule had achieved its ultimate goal.
The changes that happened were prevalent as leaders scrambled to adapt, changing the laws and rethinking the way our country works in a desperate attempt to improve our society. After the shock of the Tet Offensive, the United States abandoned the draft and turned instead to an all-volunteer army. The Selective Service, or the draft, was used in the United States from 1940 till 1973. Once the Vietnam War started, the need for the draft increased dramatically, with almost 2 million men being drafted for the whole war. Families from all over the country were fearing if their dad, son, or husband were going to get drafted next. In just the first 2 years of the United States sending soldiers to Vietnam, over 21,000 soldiers died. Then, when the Tet Offensive happened, almost 17,000 soldiers died and were injured. People all over the country started to speak out. No one wanted to be drafted, or worse, killed. The draft became highly controversial because rich men and college students could defer the draft, and it was often the poor and working class men that were called to serve for Vietnam. Eventually, the problem got so bad that it led up to the 1968 Democratic National Convention, with tens of thousands of protesters participating in marches, sit-ins, and fights with the police. This protest was another major reason that the draft ended, because the entire thing was televised, letting the whole world see how much people hated the draft. Finally, in 1971, President Richard Nixon signed legislation for the draft to be put on standby, and on January 27, 1973, the Secretary of Defense announced the end of the draft, making the U.S. Army all volunteer. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, growing distrust in unchecked executive authority helped lead to the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Before the War Powers Resolution, the President could use their commander-in-chief role to send troops to wars without approval from Congress. This was causing the President to have all the power, not following our country's original policies of shared powers and checks and balances. Once the Vietnam War rolled around, Dwight D. Eisenhower exercised this power that he had and sent many military advisors to aid the South Vietnam soldiers. In 1973, Congress had an overwhelming number of votes supporting this act, 284 votes in the House of Representatives and 75 in the Senate. This act limited the powers of the President. Now, the only way for a president to send troops overseas is for Congress to approve the action or for there to be a national emergency happening.
In the end, the Vietnam War proved that victory is often an illusion. Nations may claim success, but the cost is always measured in lives, loss, and lasting scars. In war, there are no true winners, only survivors and consequences. The Vietnam War reminds us that wars do not end in triumph, but in silence, memory, and loss.